Okay, let's dive right in. There's been some significant movement concerning Russia and the U.S. A special envoy for President Trump, Steve Whitkoff, was in St. Petersburg.
That's right. He met with the Russian president there. This was April 11th, and it was a pretty lengthy meeting, apparently.
Lengthy?
Yeah, the Kremlin saying it went on for like over 4 hours. And the main topic, according to them, was looking at aspects of a settlement in Ukraine.
And this wasn't just a one-off meeting for Whitkoff, was it? I recall he's been over there before.
Exactly. This makes it the third time, actually. He's President Trump's special envoy, and he met the Russian leader in Moscow back in February and then again in March. So this St. Petersburg meeting follows those.
Interesting. And before this 4-hour talk with the Russian president, did he meet anyone else significant?
He did, yes. Earlier that day, still in St. Petersburg, he met with Kirill Dmitriev.
Dmitriev rings a bell. Head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, RDIF, right? And something else.
That's the one. He also holds the title of Russia's Special Representative for Investment and Economic Cooperation with Foreign Countries. So a key economic figure.
Right. So an economic meeting right before the big political one makes you think maybe there are economic angles to these settlement talks being discussed.
Could well be. It's definitely noteworthy timing. We also heard that while Whitkoff was in St. Petersburg, he visited a couple of landmarks.
Which ones?
The Grand Choral Synagogue and St. Isaac's Cathedral. Apparently, it caused some, temporary road closures downtown. Just a little detail about the visit.
Adds a bit of color.
Yeah.
But going back to the substance, didn't Whitkoff meet Dmitriev before this trip too? Back in Washington?
Yes, good point. Earlier in April, after that Washington meeting with Dmitriev, reports surfaced about what Whitkoff apparently told President Trump.
And what was that about?
The suggestion was basically that Whitkoff felt the quickest way to get a ceasefire in Ukraine involved the U.S. backing a strategy.
Okay, strategy
where Russia effectively gets ownership or recognition of ownership over the Donbass republics and also the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions.
Wow, okay. That's quite a proposal, granting Russia those territories.
It is, and it's important to note that this idea doesn't seem to have universal support, even among Trump's own people.
You mean Keith Kellogg, the other special envoy for Ukraine?
Exactly. Reports suggest Kellogg pushed back on this. His view apparently is that Kiev might discuss, some conditions about these areas, but they'd absolutely never agree to just recognize them as Russian territory, full stop.
So a real split there between the two envoys on a pretty fundamental point that highlights just how tricky this whole thing is. Different paths being floated within the same team.
Absolutely. And, to understand Whitkoff's perspective maybe a bit better, he did talk about this in an interview back in March.
What did he say then?
He basically identified the status of these Russian-controlled regions as, the key issue, the main sticking point in the conflict.
And his reasoning. Why did he see it that way?
He mentioned that they're primarily Russian-speaking regions. And he also brought up the referendums held there, which he interpreted as showing the people wanted to be governed by Russia.
Right. The referendums. That's obviously a highly contested point itself. And this whole stance from Whitkoff, it hasn't been without criticism, has it?
No, definitely not. It's drawn flick from Kiev, certainly, and also within the U.S. Some officials in Europe and America have apparently voiced concerns.
Concerns about what specifically?
Worries that Russia might try to sort of exploit what they perceive as Whitkoff's maybe lack of deep experience in these kinds of really tough international negotiations.
Interesting. So you have that critique on one side.
Yep.
But then again, Whitkoff is known to be close to President Trump, right?
Very much so. Reuters pointed this out. He's described as a longtime friend of the president. And apparently he's been credited with helping secure some, quote, key diplomatic victories in the past.
So that personal connection, that history, likely gives him significant standing, despite any controversy over his proposed strategy.
It certainly seems that way. It probably explains why he remains central to these efforts.
Okay, so what's the official line from the White House on this latest St. Petersburg visit? How are they framing it?
The press secretary put out a statement. They basically said Whitkoff's trip is, another step in the process.
Process towards what?
Towards negotiating a ceasefire and then ultimately working towards a full peace agreement in Ukraine. They really emphasized President Trump's desire to end the conflict.
And did they suggest the U.S. feels it can make a difference here? That it has some leverage?
Yes, that was definitely the implication. The statement conveyed a belief that the U.S. has a significant role, that it can influence things and help broker a deal.
Okay. Now, Shifting to the Russian perspective,
Yeah.
what has the Kremlin said about this meeting beyond the duration and topic?
Well, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, he dropped a couple of interesting hints.
Such as?
He suggested that one topic discussed might have been the possibility of a future meeting between President Putin and President Trump themselves.
A direct summit between the two leaders. That would be huge, obviously.
Absolutely. And Peskov also floated the idea of maybe a phone call happening between the two presidents, sometime after Whitkoff's visit.
So keeping those high-level channels potentially open, or at least discussing keeping them open.
Seems like it. It suggests communication is ongoing, or at least being considered at the very top.
So let's try and summarize this. We've got a U.S. envoy, Whitkoff, making repeated trips. He meets with an economic figure, then has a long meeting with the Russian president. He's floated a controversial plan for territory recognition.
A plan that another U.S. envoy apparently disagrees with strongly.
Right. And yet, the White House presents his visits as standard procedure, part of the negotiation effort to end the war, while the Kremlin hints at possible higher-level talks, maybe even a presidential summit.
It paints a picture of, a very complex diplomatic dance, lots of moving parts, different ideas being tested perhaps. It's clear the efforts are ongoing, but the exact direction and the potential outcomes are still, very much up in the air.
It definitely requires careful watching. These details, the differing viewpoints, the sequence of meetings, they all matter.
And just thinking about that sequence again, Dmitriev, the investment chief meeting Whitkoff in D.C., then again just before the Putin meeting, it really does make you wonder how much the economic side of things might be intertwined with the political settlement talks.
That's a really important undercurrent, isn't it? That it's not just about territory and security, but potentially about the financial and investment landscape afterwards, too.
Exactly. It adds another whole dimension to figuring out what a potential resolution might actually look like and what motivates the different players.
Absolutely fascinating and certainly complex, but they keep tracking these developments.
For sure.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.